This second recording is the most difficult one probably. I guess I would want to head it, who says and who has authority. And I don't wish to draw blood or to denigrate any of my brothers in the ministry. But of course my removal from the international and national executives in terms of our original constitution, the constitution at the time, was illegal. It's left me in a dilemma as to what extent I speak with authority to God Squad concerning anything, its theology, its practices, its missiology, anything to do with God Squad. I've decided that I need at least to give some kind of substantial response, so it's on record. If I hope everyone will take me seriously enough to look at this, but if not, that maybe in the future people might. It's interesting to me that the new group that is set up to guard the theology of God Squad the authority of which I am completely ignorant, because nobody has approached me as the founder of our theology and mission policy. Nobody's approached me for any advice or hints or useful content from all the experiences of well over 40 years in terms of God Squad, and of course over 50 years of ministry in many, many different situations. And I guess I was partly sparked off when I saw that missiology was listed as one of the areas to be guarded, and not having been spoken to at all, that surprised me, in that I have a doctorate in missiology, and as far as I know, no one else in God Squad has done that many years of work and research to have that particular qualification. So I'm surprised that there was no attempt at all to contact me. And secondly, I was surprised in appointing such a group that nobody asked for any suggestions, not just as to who should be in that group, but what principles should be in place by which such a group will be chosen. Part of that was aggravated by the fact that while I am belatedly listed as one of the people on that list, though with no particular screening authority or senior position to help guide that theological journey of discourse, there are a number of people within our movement that are definitely qualified in terms of their training and experience that were bypassed for people who were less qualified. For instance, We have one of our sisters in Northern Victoria who has been studying for several years now, and I've been her supervisor. I know that she's received extinctions for the theology work she's done and biblical work she's done, including some quite excellent material on looking at cross-cultural evangelism and the way in which God's Squad has operated in the field of applying the gospel to a culture reasonably alien to the message we bring. I notice she's not on the list. And I notice Mav, who has a bachelor's degree and particularly has studied Hebrew and studied the relationship of Jewish culture to Christianity. He's not on the list. I notice there are some on the list who, as far as I know, have no background studies in these areas. Paul Baker doesn't have a degree in theology, but he's got a PhD and has been a lecturer in tertiary institutions for quite some time. That gives him a particular gift in communication, and over those many years as one of the earliest actual members of God's Squad, he has spent enormous hours in dialogue with Jewish, practicing Jewish brothers in prayer and inquiring into the nature of Jewish understanding, and looking at that alongside of the Christian gospel. So he's another highly qualified person that's, as far as I know, is not on the list. Now, you might say, well, you're an old bloke now, what right have you got to enter into this foray? Well, if any want the material, I can provide extensive research material that shows an interesting fact, that faith-based organisations that maintain the integrity of their belief system and of their faith have one particular common mark, and that is faith-based organisations that keep to their original charter are those who treasure their story and the vision of their founders, and who in fact make sure that even middle management, not just senior management, the story and the belief systems of the original movement are rehearsed and treasured at least annually amongst all staff. Now that would mean that if we want to keep some security in holding to our original values, an accurate story of God's Squad and its theology needs to be really passed on to all members on an annual basis, maybe at an annual national run or whatever. But that leads me to another issue. Who says and who has authority to say? Now, don't get me wrong. What I'm going to say now is not an attempt to put myself in any way in the limelight as another St. Paul, but if I'm to take my guidance from Scripture, which I do, then I study all of the Scriptures to see what happened in the book of Acts. And that's where we started with our ministry, was actually in teaching verse by verse for, I think it was something like 87 weeks, well over a year, looking at the history of the early church as Luke recorded it in the book of Acts. And beyond that, to read the epistles, because many of the epistles are not just doctrine, they tell the story of the writers of those epistles. It's interesting that the Corinthian church was not a church, as I understand, that Paul the Apostle actually planted. But he did have a great love for them. And perhaps it was because he wasn't the actual planter of that church, that critics of Paul and cynics about his authority, who says, how does Paul say, why should we listen to him, kind of thing, that they arose in the midst of the Corinthian congregation. And please bear with me, I want to read you a bit. And I hope, because I want to read a reasonable slab of scripture here, you won't just be mentally lazy and back off from it. Let me read you a little bit from Paul when he defends the authority of his ministry. Because many were saying, you know, we've got our apostles, who does he think he is? He said, Paul, make a personal appeal to you, I who am said to be meek and mild when I'm with you, but harsh with you when I'm away. In other words, he's nice when he's here, but when he writes his epistles, he's not so nice. By the gentleness and kindness of Christ, I beg you not to force me to be harsh when I come, for I am sure I can deal harshly with those who say that we act out of worldly motives. It is true that we live in the world, but we don't fight from worldly motives. The weapons we use to fight are not the world's weapons, but God's powerful weapons we use to destroy strongholds. And the strongholds he describes are arguments. So the church was in a state of argument about Paul and what he'd said, and whether he had authority to say what he said. Because it says, we destroy these strongholds, we destroy false arguments, we pull down every proud obstacle that is raised against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive and make it obey Christ. And after you've proved your complete loyalty, we will be ready to punish any act of disloyalty. Now, I just want to say, folks, they're pretty strong words. This isn't written to a bunch of outside pagans. This is written to the members of a first century church, and so early in the movement there's already debates about authority. You are looking at the outward appearance of things. Is there someone there who reckons himself or herself to belong to Christ? Well, let them think again about themselves, because we belong to Christ just as much as they do. For I'm not ashamed, even if I boasted somewhat too much about the authority the Lord has given us, authority to build you up and not to tear you down. I do not want it to appear that I'm trying to frighten you with letters. I want to say, I don't want to try and frighten you with films either. Paul's letters, quote unquote, are strong and severe, but when he's with us in person, he's weak and his words are nothing. That's a quote apparently from somebody that was criticising him. Such a person must understand there is no difference between what we write in our letters when we're away and what we'll do when we're with you. Of course, we would not dare to classify ourselves or compare ourselves with those who rate themselves so highly. how stupid they are. They make up their own standards to measure themselves by, and they judge themselves by their own standards. But as for us, however, our boasting will not go beyond certain limits. It will stay within the limits of the work which God has set for us to do. And this includes our work among you. And since you are within these limits, we are not going beyond them when we come to you, bring the good news about Christ. So we don't boast about the work others have done beyond the limits God has set for us. Indeed, we hope that your faith might grow, that we may be able to do a greater work among you, always within the limits that God has set. Then we can preach the good news in other countries beyond you, and shall not have to boast about work already done in somebody else's field. The Scriptures say, whoever wants to boast must boast about what the Lord has done. For it is people of whom the Lord thinks well who are really approved, not people who think well of themselves. Now in the next chapter from St. Paul, he goes on to say, I wish you'd tolerate me even when I'm a bit foolish, please do. I'm jealous for you, just as God is. You're like a virgin who's been promised in marriage to one man only, to Christ. I'm afraid your minds will be corrupted, that you'll abandon your full and pure devotion to Christ in the same way that Eve was deceived. For you gladly tolerate anyone who comes to you and preaches a different Jesus, not the one we preached, and you accept a spirit and a gospel completely different from the spirit and the gospel you received from us. I do not think that I am the least bit inferior to those very special so-called apostles of yours. Perhaps I am an amateur in speaking, but certainly not in knowledge. We have made this clear to you at all times and in all conditions. And then he goes on to describe how he worked amongst the people of the church when he did visit. He goes on to talk about people that have criticised him, but he goes on to talk about how much he treasures this church. For all of his criticism about them being a bit open to critics against him, he goes on to talk about their great generosity as they gave gifts to the poor and how much that was known throughout the region. I will go on doing what I'm doing now in order to keep those other apostles from having any reason for boasting and saying they work in the same way that we do. Those men are not true apostles, they're false apostles, who lie about their work and disguise themselves to look like real apostles. Well, no wonder, even Satan can disguise himself like an angel of light. Now, I don't want this to be misunderstood. I'm not saying anybody of my brothers are satanic or anything like that. But what I am saying is that what this passage of Scripture shows is that in a New Testament thriving church with no lesser extraordinary apostle than St. Paul, conflicts about authority to speak, conflicts about who really are the leaders that speak on behalf of the church are occurring so early in the first centuries of the church. So it ought not to surprise us, brothers, that we'll have to battle this through from time to time. And it's partly for that reason that I'm going to do what I'm going to do now. I've never really laid this out before. And if you read through those chapters about chapter 9, 10, 11, 12 of Paul's epistle to the Corinthians, you'll see that he feels he's got to defend himself, but he also is embarrassed he doesn't want to boast, and he says that. He's sort of caught between saying, if I don't give you my credentials, then there'll be a lack of substantial basis for you to listen to my voice any more than any other Tom, Dick and Harry who might flit through the church. And for that reason, embarrassed and, like St. Paul, feeling, oh goodness, I'm going to make a fool of myself by arguing the case for my own authority. I'm going to do it with regrets, but because I believe at this stage in the history of God Squad, because of what was done to me, I believe quite unconstitutionally. It's put me out on the edge where I know I'm very grateful that the team has published some of my work and recordings in recent days. Very grateful for that and appreciate that. But as I said, I need to ask, who's in charge? Who speaks ultimately with authority on the theology of God Squad? How were people appointed to authoritative positions in this respect? What were their credentials? What were their histories? What were their experiences? In other words, Smithy, what right have you got at this late stage to open your gob and challenge anything? Well, I have the right that I had a calling from God to start this shape of God Squad. And I'm not too sure how to interpret the verse, the gifts and callings of God are without repentance. But as I understand it, they mean providing one walks with God, when you get a call from God, you stay faithful to it. Like St. Paul, who said, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. And as he's in prison facing execution, he doesn't quit his ministry. He doesn't stop writing his epistles. He doesn't shut down his strong challenges to the existing church. And I feel even if this is close to a swan song, I can't do that either. Let me give you a little history. Because Paul speaks of those who've never met him and never seen him in his epistle here, as well as those that know him well. My background was to be brought up in Methodism, as I described earlier on in the previous tape. And that gave me a strong call to a biblical theology, and also one that embraced the issues of social justice. Wesley was one of those early preachers that, although he was actually very conservative, a bit of a Tory in the political system, he nevertheless called his followers to civil disobedience when the state was disobeying the just laws of God. I remember finding a very remote quote of his as to why he didn't support the American Revolution. And it was a strange quote. He said, I didn't support the American Revolution because the Afro-American slaves and the native peoples of North America had a prior claim to revolution before the male landed gentry of England who didn't want to pay His Majesty's taxes. Which is very interesting, puts a different spin on things altogether, but Wesley set out, wrote very strong articles against lawyers for the way in which they made their law cases stretch out and out and out and out so they make more money out of them. He wrote about the prison system, and way back then in the 1700s pointed out that putting young people into the prison system was a way of hardening them and making them into hardened criminals. Ain't that up to date? I could go on and on. Amazing stuff about the holistic application of the gospel. So I grew up with that, with an evangelical, biblical form of Methodism. And I sat under the preaching of my father for many years, and he was he was a preacher, but he primarily was concerned with what we call expository preaching rather than topical preaching. In other words, he wouldn't just take a topic like prayer or salvation or something else. He would actually open up the book of Romans or some other biblical book and develop it verse by verse in the way in which we did historically in God's Squad in our first 20 years. So I guess I got a good training in that. And when I went to Bible college, the qualification I got when I was at what became Bible College of Victoria and now has a new name, what I obtained then was what was called the LTH in those days, Licentiate Theology, followed by a degree in Christian education, a diploma in Christian education. And that sort of linked my experience as a trained teacher in both high school and primary school into using that in taking biblical and theological material and bringing it to young people with good teaching methodology. Now, of course, my highest qualification was in doing a PhD, and that PhD was in majored in the application of the social sciences to the ability to translate the gospel into different cultures. So it emphasized cultural anthropology, and my primary subjects were in cultural anthropology, but they included, in a country where you had to sit for exams in doctoral work, that included doing subjects on Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and nativistic cults. So it was a very broad study in what we call missiology, the study of mission in cross-cultural contexts. Now, just to give you a bit of an idea of the acceptance that really Squad knows nothing much about, but let me give you just a few little snippets. I served on the Victorian special council was put together to look at evangelism for the different churches. That was called the Church's Consultative Committee on Evangelism. And at one stage was involved on the Evangelical Alliance of Victoria. Quite some years ago, at a time when the Uniting Church, I think it may have been the Methodist, but I think it was the Uniting Church at that stage in the Northern Territory, were to be handing over properties back to the Aboriginal people. I was invited to go to the Northern Territory to be the theologian for the Northern Territory Synod. Now that synod is, in terms of areas, I think one of the biggest synods in the whole world. It's a huge synod. It goes down to the edge of South Australia and Northern Territory and Arnhem Land, all of that. Huge, huge one. And it was a wonderful, wonderful week or so, mixing particularly with the Pitjantjatjara people, where a very great expert really on culture who didn't have a degree in it, but who'd served so long amongst the indigenous people that he'd been asked to be as a white man, had been asked to be a lawman for the Pitjantjatjara people. He was specially ordained separately by the tribal people at that conference. It was a very significant conference because I had the real privilege of being alongside of a member of the Australian High Court, which of course is the most powerful position you can have in this country. And the High Court member who actually wrote the report on the stolen children that became the official Australian report, actually retired from being a High Court judge, which is amazing, to, I think, become the moderator of the Uniting Church in Western Australia, because he was so concerned about things he saw within the Uniting Church that he felt were faltering. Anyway, it was a great privilege to sit alongside of him and to do theological work while he did amazing work on giving advice on law, and as a High Court judge, give the best advice he could to the church as to how they should rectify some of our historic past concerning our Indigenous people. But that was no mean position, but what it does show is that whatever people back home think, that was the respect for which the Lord graciously placed me in the wider church. I, many years later, was invited to go to Canberra, and for a couple of years was the theologian in residence for the Anglicare of that district, which was Canberra-Goulburn. It was the huge welfare network that went right down the south coast and right out to Goulburn and all of the national capital. And they'd called me in to theologically examine why it was that organisations like Anglicare had lost their basically Christian foundations and had become pretty well a secular welfare agency. And they asked me to analyse that, find out the reasons for it, and track a possible path back to putting the denomination, the Anglican denomination, back into its faith basis in its welfare work. As far as lecturing is concerned, my first lecturing in theology started off actually at Kingsley College, the Methodist, Wesleyan Methodist College. And they brought me in there when I was much younger to lecture on contemporary theology, to look at where theology was shifting back then. That would have been, I guess, in the 60s. Over the following years, I lectured a number of times at Whitley College, the Baptist College, mainly on anthropology and its use in understanding mission and how to do cross-cultural ministry. For a couple of years, just before they closed it down actually, I lectured at the Reformed Theological College at Geelong. And that was an interesting ask, they being Calvinist Reformed and me being Methodist in background. But I had a wonderful time there and had some of their own lecturers actually attended my classes for a series on the faith that does justice, the historical, denominational and biblical grounds for a gospel that addresses the issues of human injustice and human need. I spent some time in South Australia at the major interdenominational Bible college over there. So all I'm saying is that inside of the church circles, I've had a broad experience. Baptist, Reformed Church, Methodist. One of the groups was more Church of Christ than anything else. So right across the denominations, that's been respected. It was interesting that when some people running a big arts conference in Finland had heard of the ministry I was doing in Germany and in Holland and asked me to go and minister on the arts and do Bible teaching to do with the arts. I got a letter to say that because it was controlled by the Lutheran Church, and most people in Finland are Lutheran, that they needed to have one or two letters from bona fide members of Reformed Calvinist communities to assure them that I wouldn't lead their young people astray in Finland as a Methodist. And I'd done so much work by then, including the first evangelistic mission ever held in Victoria amongst the Reformed churches, that I got a good bill of health from the Reformed churches to go and minister there in Finland, and had a wonderful time while I was there. Over the years, conferences that have been sort of on the edge of the arts have included the two major New Zealand conferences, Greenbelt in England, PYfwUDzLZn2iGMnxJFPaPbbx in America, and a number of other smaller festivals, and particularly Christian artists, European Christian artists, centred in Holland and sometimes held in Germany, which gave me a lot of connection with folks that later on were to be involved with God Squad in that part of the world. So I could go on with more, but just to say, the authority that I have in the calling of God to give leadership and founding to God Squad as we know it is backed up by an extraordinarily broad ecumenical support from Christian churches right across the board. As far as I know, we were the first evangelical Protestant group to ever be invited to go and do missions with where we insisted on Catholics having full status on the committees in the decision-making of preparing those particular missions. And some of those were everywhere from Alice Springs. Had a wonderful time in Alice Springs with some of the Catholic brethren out there, through to Clare, where we stayed at one of the holy retreat centres there in Clare, in South Australia, in northern Victoria, in Albury. We were the first group that I know of that actually said, we won't hold an evangelical mission where the Catholics are not invited to have full status on the committees. So I give that to your friends with a sort of bit of a yucky feeling in that, this is not an issue of boasting something, but I have my critics. And I feel at this stage, if I'm to have any authority in giving some guidance and wisdom to God Squad out of the many years of Bible teaching, I mean, from 1972 to 82, that 10 years, virtually every week, I did expository teaching from the text of the Bible. And before that, as a pastor in Gippsland, I was teaching every week in the Methodist Church. I was a pastor. What I'm saying is, I have both a sense of extraordinary call from God, and some of you have heard me tell the story of that, and I don't like repeating it like it's a charismatic story to shut off any debate or discussion. But it was distinctly in 2 prayer meetings that people stood up 12 months apart in different locations, both university student meetings, both all-night prayer meetings, in which someone in both cases stood up and said, "Behold, I send you as an apostle to the Gentiles and not to the Jews," which at the time I didn't understand until I got deeply into the book of Acts and the writings of St. Paul and recognised the conflict between the Jewish established community and the Gentiles, and the conflict between the organised church in our day and those like hippies and bikers and others that were out in the fringe. And that was my supreme calling. And that's why I didn't take on a permanent role within my denomination and be a good boy and suit all of that, because I knew God had called me to reach out to my brothers and sisters on the fringes. Not just bikers, artists, political dissidents, all sorts of other creative, edgy people. So, as St. Paul said, I repeat, no one should think that I'm a fool. If you do, at least accept me as a fool, so that I have little to boast of. Of course, what I'm saying now is not that the Lord necessarily would like me to say in this manner of boasting. I'm really talking like a fool. But since there are so many who boast for merely human reasons, I'll do the same. You yourselves are so wise, and so you gladly tolerate fools. You tolerate anyone who orders you about, or takes advantage of you and traps you, or looks down on you, or slaps you in the face. I am ashamed to admit that we were too timid to do such things. But if anyone dares to boast about something, I'm talking like a fool. I'd like to be just as daring. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. And so St. Paul goes on to describe how he suffered in his missions, how he was shipwrecked and all those other things. And I just want to say, folks, I'm making some strong statements here because I believe I have the experience, the learning, the authority, and much more important, a very strong, clear calling of God to give leadership to the movement. I'm not dead yet, and I don't think that what I have to offer in God's squad is anywhere near finished. And I pray that you'll open your hearts to me and help me to enter into this very, very difficult and conflicting period in the history of the church as we press on to be obedient, as St. Paul puts it, to the heavenly calling